The impossible challenge. The crystalline spires of the Galactic Academy of Advanced Sciences pierced through the swirling atmosphere of Nexus Prime, a planet chosen specifically for its unpredictable weather patterns and challenging terrain. Inside, the Academy's environmental simulation chamber, 63 students from 27 different species gathered nervously, their various appendages, tentacles, and sensory organs focused on the imposing figure at the front of the room. Professor Zarthax of the Krillian race stood 8 feet tall, his chitinous exoskeleton reflecting the harsh artificial lighting. His compound eyes scanned the assembled students with what many had learned to recognize as barely concealed disdain. The Krillians were known throughout the galaxy for their engineering prowess and their belief that theoretical perfection trumped practical application every time. Today's examination will determine whether you possess the fundamental skills necessary to continue in this program, Zarthax announced, his voice resonating through the chamber like grinding metal. You will construct a Class 3 survival shelter capable of withstanding the environmental conditions of a Category 7 hostile world. The room erupted in various expressions of shock. Chirps, whistles, color changes, and electromagnetic pulses filled the air as students processed this information. A Category 7 world meant extreme temperature fluctuations, corrosive atmosphere, unpredictable gravity shifts, and potentially hostile native elements. Sarah Chen stood quietly in the back corner, her dark eyes studying the professor's body language. As the only human in the advanced survival engineering program, she had grown accustomed to being overlooked. Humans had only joined the Galactic Confederation 15 years ago, and most species still viewed them as primitive newcomers who relied too heavily on instinct rather than calculation. You will have access to standard expedition supplies, Zarthax continued, gesturing toward the material dispensers along the walls. These include molecular binders, force field generators, atmospheric processors, and construction nanites. You have precisely 1 standard hour to complete your shelter. Sarah noticed the confident postures of her classmates beginning to wilt. The Vortanian twins immediately began interfacing with their quantum computers, their bioluminescent patches flickering as they processed atmospheric data. The Selenite delegation huddled together, their crystalline forms resonating as they shared calculations telepathically. Environmental parameters will shift every 10 minutes, Zarthax added, his mandibles clicking in what Sarah had learned was amusement. Failure to adapt will result in structural collapse and immediate disqualification. The professor activated the simulation field, and instantly, the sterile chamber transformed into a hellish landscape. The ground became rough and uneven, composed of sharp volcanic glass and unstable sediment. The atmosphere turned a sickly yellow-green, and Sarah felt her environmental suit adjust to protect her from the corrosive elements. Begin, Zarthax commanded. Chaos erupted as students rushed toward the supply stations. The Rigelians immediately began assembling their trademark geometric frameworks, while the aquatic Hydrosians worked on pressurized dome concepts. Everyone seemed focused on accessing the most advanced technology available. Sarah, however, walked calmly to the nearest supply dispenser and began selecting what others considered the most basic items. She grabbed simple metal poles, flexible polymer, sheets, a basic cutting tool, and several spools of high-tensile cable. While her classmates argued over who would get the limited quantum processors, Sarah found herself with plenty of access to materials nobody else wanted. She surveyed the terrain with the same careful attention her grandfather had taught her during camping trips in the Colorado Rockies. The ground here might be alien, but the principles were the same. She needed stable foundation points, natural wind barriers, and proper drainage angles. Finding a suitable location near a natural rock formation, Sarah began her work. She didn't run calculations or simulations. Instead, she felt the wind patterns against her face, tested the ground stability with her boots, and observed how the corrosive atmospheric particles settled in certain areas. Using the cutting tool, she shaped the metal poles into specific angles, creating a framework that would flex with environmental changes rather than resist them. The polymer sheets were arranged in overlapping layers, sealed with a simple heat bonding technique she'd learned fixing tents during her time in the Earth Defense Corps. 10 minutes passed and the first environmental shift occurred. The gravity increased by 30%, and the atmospheric pressure dropped significantly. Several students cried out as their rigid structures groaned under the sudden change. The Mantaxian engineer watched in horror as his perfectly calculated, crystalline matrix shattered like glass. Sarah's shelter swayed and adjusted, the flexible joints she'd incorporated allowing it to adapt to the new conditions. She continued working methodically, adding ventilation flaps that could open or close automatically based on pressure differentials, and creating a double wall system with insulating air pockets. Professor Zarthax prowled among the students, his scanner continuously analyzing their progress. He paused occasionally to make disparaging comments about inefficient designs or poor material choices. Most students redoubled their efforts under his scrutiny, adding more complex systems and safeguards to their structures. 20 minutes in, Sarah was already installing her drainage system, using natural channels in the ground enhanced by simple trenching. She noticed Professor Zarthax approaching and continued working without acknowledging his presence. "Cadet Chen," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I see you've chosen to ignore the advanced materials entirely. Do you not understand the complexity of the environmental parameters?" Sarah looked up briefly, her hands still working, on securing a cable. "I understand them perfectly, Professor, that's why I'm keeping it simple." Zarthax's compound eyes glittered dangerously. "Simple? This is not a primitive human camping expedition. This is advanced survival engineering." "With respect, sir," Sarah replied, returning to her work. "Complexity doesn't always mean effectiveness. Sometimes the best solution is the one that works." The professor made a dismissive clicking sound and moved on, but Sarah noticed he glanced back at her shelter several times as he continued his rounds. 30 minutes passed, bringing another environmental shift. This time the wind speed increased dramatically, and acidic rain began to fall. The Satanian team's force field generator overloaded, trying to compensate for the multiple stressors. 2 Andromedans abandoned their half-built structure entirely as their nanite swarm malfunctioned in the corrosive rain. Sarah's shelter held firm. The angled walls shed the acidic rain into her drainage channels, while the flexible frame bent with the wind rather than fighting it. She was now working on the entrance system, creating an airlock using nothing more than overlapping polymer sheets and weighted flaps. 40 minutes in, more than half the class had experienced critical failures. The simulation field was littered, with collapsed structures, sparking electronics, and frustrated students trying to salvage what they could. Sarah noticed several classmates watching her work with poorly concealed amazement. She added the final touches to her shelter: emergency beacon mounts, equipment storage areas, and even a simple water collection system that would neutralize the acidic rain through a series of filter layers. With 15 minutes still remaining, she stepped back and surveyed her work. The shelter stood approximately 8 feet tall at its peak, with a sloped design that would handle any directional wind. The entrance faced away from the prevailing weather patterns, and the entire structure had a low profile that minimized exposure to the harsh elements. It wasn't pretty by Galactic standards, but it was solid, adaptable, and completely functional. Sarah activated her emergency beacon and placed it in the designated mount, then sat down on a nearby rock to wait. The final environmental shift occurred. 5 minutes later, a combination of electromagnetic interference and seismic activity. More structures failed, but Sarah's shelter merely swayed with the ground movement, its simple design unaffected by the electronic interference that crippled more advanced systems. When the timer reached 0, only 12 structures remained standing. Of those, only 3 were actually habitable. Sarah's was one of them. Professor Zarthax stood before the exhausted students, his scanner displaying the analysis results on a holographic screen. "As expected, most of you have failed to grasp the fundamental principles of adaptive engineering," he began. Then his eyes fixed on Sarah. "However, there appears to be one anomaly." The holographic display shifted to show Sarah's shelter, with streams of data indicating its performance metrics. Cadet Chen's structure maintained integrity through all environmental shifts. Power consumption, 0. Electronic dependencies, none. Structural adaptation rating, 94%. Murmurs rippled through the assembled students. The Vortanian twins exchanged rapid light pulses of disbelief. The senior Rigelian engineer's geometric headplates shifted to a configuration indicating profound surprise. More remarkably, Zarthax continued, his tone betraying confusion, this structure was completed in 38 minutes. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah remained seated on her rock, her expression neutral as 62 pairs of alien eyes turned to stare at her. She had learned early in her time at the academy that drawing attention to human capabilities often resulted in skepticism or hostility. Professor Zarthax's compound eyes narrowed as he studied the data again. Cadet Chen, explain your methodology. Sarah stood slowly, brushing dust from her environmental suit. I used basic engineering principles adapted to the environment, sir. Flexible structure to handle variable conditions, passive systems to avoid power dependencies, and simple materials that wouldn't fail under stress. You used no calculations? The professor's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation. I used observation and experience, Sarah replied. My species has survived in hostile environments for thousands of years without advanced technology. We learned to work with nature, not against it. Zarthax downloaded the complete analysis of Sarah's shelter to his personal datapad, his expression unreadable. This design will be submitted for comprehensive review. Class dismissed. As the students filed out of the simulation chamber, many cast curious or resentful glances at Sarah. She packed up her basic tools, ignoring the whispers in various alien languages. But as she reached the exit, she noticed something that made her pause. Professor Zarthax stood before the holographic display, still studying her shelter design. And unless she was mistaken, his compound eyes were focused not on the technical specifications but on the simple elegance of the structure itself. For just a moment, Sarah thought she saw something that looked almost like respect in his alien features. Then the moment passed, and she walked out into the corridor, already thinking about how she might improve the design for next time. Behind her, unknown to Sarah, Professor Zarthax made a small notation in his personal log. Human adaptive engineering capabilities exceed preliminary assessments. Further observation required. Human ingenuity at work. The following morning arrived with the artificial dawn of Nexus Prime casting its violet light through the Academy's transparent aluminum windows. Sarah Chen sat alone in the cafeteria, reviewing her engineering notes, while sipping what the food synthesizers claimed was coffee. It tasted nothing like Earth coffee, but she'd grown accustomed to the bitter, slightly metallic flavor. Around her, clusters of students from various species huddled in their usual groups. But today something was different. She caught frequent glances in her direction, some curious, others suspicious. The universal translator in her ear picked up fragments of conversations, primitive design, yet somehow must have cheated. Humans don't even have quantum processing capabilities. Sarah ignored them, focusing instead on sketching improvements to yesterday's shelter design. She'd identified several areas where minor modifications could increase the structure's efficiency without adding complexity. Her stylus moved across, the digital pad creating clean lines and practical annotations. May I join you? The voice startled her. Looking up, she saw Crick 7, a mechanoid student whose people were known for their integration of biological and technological systems. His chrome-plated features were arranged in what she'd learned was a neutral expression. Sure, Sarah replied, gesturing to the empty space across from her. Crick 7 settled his considerable bulk onto the reinforced seating, his optical sensors focusing on her sketches. I analyzed your shelter design through 14 different algorithmic models last night. It should not have worked. Sarah smiled slightly. But it did. Precisely. Crick 7's head tilted with a soft whirring sound. My calculations indicate a 92% probability of failure, yet the empirical evidence contradicts this. How do you reconcile this paradox? Before Sarah could answer, the cafeteria's atmosphere notification system chimed, indicating class was about to begin. She gathered her materials, considering her response. Sometimes, she said finally, The universe doesn't care about our calculations, it just cares about what works. The environmental engineering classroom was arranged in an amphitheater style, with Professor Zarthax's teaching platform at the center. As students filed in, Sarah noticed an unusual addition to the standard equipment. Her shelter from yesterday's test had been reconstructed in the center of the room. Today, Professor Zarthax announced without preamble, we will dissect an anomaly. His compound eyes fixed on Sarah as she took her seat. Cadet Chen's structure represents a fundamental challenge to established engineering protocols. We will examine why a design that violates 37 standard principles not only survived, but exceeded performance metrics. The lights dimmed, and holographic displays materialized around the shelter. Data streams showed stress analysis, material composition, and environmental adaptation ratings. Zarthax moved through the information with practiced efficiency. First observation, material selection. Cadet Chen chose basic components ignored by every other student. Standard protocol dictates using the most advanced materials available. Yet these primitive alternatives showed superior performance. Why? He directed the question at the class, but his gaze remained on Sarah. The selenite delegate raised a crystalline appendage. Perhaps the human accidentally selected materials with unknown properties. Negative, Zarthax replied. Analysis confirms standard composition. Cadet Chen, explain your selection criteria. Sarah stood, feeling the weight of dozens of alien stares. I chose materials based on their failure patterns, not their optimal performance ratings. Confused silence greeted this statement. Zarthax's mandibles clicked. Elaborate. Advanced materials often have specific optimal conditions, Sarah explained, moving toward the reconstructed shelter. When those conditions change, they fail catastrophically. Basic materials might not perform as well at peak, but they degrade, predictably. In a variable environment, I'd rather have something that bends than something that breaks. She picked up one of the metal poles, flexing it slightly. This alloy has a lower tensile strength than the quantum-reinforced alternatives, but it maintains structural integrity across a wider range of conditions. When the gravity shifted, it bent but didn't snap. The human is suggesting that inferior materials are somehow superior? The speaker was Vexhai, a Rigelian whose species prided themselves on mathematical precision. I'm suggesting that inferior and superior depend on context, Sarah countered. You can't evaluate materials in isolation. You have to consider the system they're part of. Zarthax's scanner highlighted the shelter's joint system. Second observation, structural connections. Rather than rigid molecular bonds, Cadet Chen employed mechanical joints with significant play. Standard engineering principles classify this as inefficient. Sarah approached the highlighted section. On Earth, we have a saying. The reed that bends in the wind survives while the mighty oak is uprooted. These joints aren't loose by accident. They're designed to distribute stress dynamically. She demonstrated by applying pressure to one wall. The entire structure shifted subtly, the force dispersing throughout the framework rather than concentrating at single points. When the environmental parameters changed, the shelter adapted rather than resisting. Traditional rigid structures try to maintain their exact shape, which requires exponentially more energy as conditions become extreme. The Vortanian twins pulsed in synchronized communication before one spoke, but precise calculations ensure optimal configuration for any given condition set. For any single condition, yes, Sarah agreed. But we weren't dealing with single conditions. Every 10 minutes brought new challenges. By the time you calculate and adjust for one change, another has already occurred. She moved to the shelter's entrance system. This design assumes constant change. Instead of trying to predict specific conditions, I created systems that could handle ranges of conditions. Professor Zarthax circled the shelter, his scanner collecting continuous data. Third observation, complete absence of powered systems. Current survival protocols mandate multiple redundant power sources. Cadet Chen's design uses none. Because power systems are points of failure, Sarah explained. Every powered component needs energy, control systems, and maintenance. In extreme conditions, these become vulnerabilities. My shelter uses passive systems exclusively: gravity for drainage, pressure differentials for ventilation, material properties for insulation. She indicated the ventilation flaps. These open and close based on air pressure alone. No sensors, no actuators, no power requirements. If one fails, it fails in a safe position, and the others compensate. The class had grown quiet. Many students, leaning forward with interest. Zarthax's teaching assistant, a gelatinous hydrosian, rippled with contemplation. Fourth observation, Zarthax continued, his tone subtly different. Construction time. Cadet Chen completed her shelter in 38 minutes without computational assistance. Standard assembly requires extensive pre-calculation and precise sequencing. Sarah nodded. I used a modular approach based on repeated patterns. Each section follows the same basic principles adjusted for local conditions. It's like learning to cook. Once you understand how ingredients interact, you can create countless dishes without following exact recipes. You're comparing advanced engineering to food preparation? Vexhi's tone dripped with disdain. Why not? Sarah countered. Both involve combining materials to achieve specific results. Both require understanding fundamental principles rather than memorizing procedures. And both benefit from practical experience. She gestured to the shelter's overall design. This isn't a blueprint I memorized. It's an adaptation of principles I've learned through experience. My grandfather taught me to build shelters in the Rocky Mountains. My mother showed me how to reinforce structures against typhoons in the Philippines. The materials here are different, but physics works the same way everywhere. Professor Zarthax had been unusually quiet during this exchange. Now he activated a new holographic display showing stress test results. Final observation. Performance under extreme conditions. When we increased the environmental severity beyond test parameters, most functioning shelters failed at 140% standard load. Cadet Chen's structure maintained integrity until 340% standard load. Murmurs rippled through the classroom. That was well beyond any reasonable safety margin. The design incorporates multiple failure modes, Sarah explained. If one system is overwhelmed, others activate automatically. The drainage channels become structural supports under extreme gravity. The ventilation system can seal completely against toxic atmosphere. The walls can partially collapse inward without compromising the core survival space. She paused, organizing her thoughts. On Earth, we have a concept called graceful degradation. It means systems should fail gradually and predictably, not catastrophically. Every component of this shelter is designed to fail in ways that preserve the overall function as long as possible. Crick 7 raised a mechanical hand. Your approach suggests prioritizing adaptability over optimization. This contradicts fundamental engineering principles. Does it? Sarah asked. Or does it just apply them differently? You optimize for known conditions. I optimize for unknown conditions. In a controlled environment, your approach is superior. In chaos, mine has advantages. Professor Zarthax closed the holographic displays, his compound eyes unreadable. Cadet Chen has presented an alternative engineering paradigm. Whether this represents innovation or regression remains to be determined. He paused, seeming to wrestle with his next words. However, the empirical results demand serious consideration. For next class, all students will analyze the human approach and submit comparative studies with traditional methodologies. As the dismissal chime sounded, students filed out with animated discussions in multiple languages. Sarah began packing her materials when Professor Zarthax approached her. Cadet Chen, he said quietly. Your species has been spacefaring for only 15 of your years. How did you develop these techniques? Sarah considered the question carefully. We didn't develop them for space, Professor. We developed them for Earth. Humans evolved on a planet with extreme weather, natural disasters, and limited resources. We had to learn to adapt or die. These aren't advanced techniques. They're survival instincts refined over thousands of years. Zarthax's mandibles moved in what might have been thoughtful consideration. Perhaps, he said slowly, there is more to learn from primitive worlds than we assumed. As Sarah left the classroom, she found a small group of students waiting in the corridor. The mechanoid Crick 7, the Hydrosian teaching assistant, and surprisingly, one of the Vortanian twins. "We wish to understand more," Crick 7 stated simply. "Would you be willing to share additional human engineering principles?" Sarah looked at the diverse group, seeing genuine curiosity rather than condescension for the first time since arriving at the academy. "Sure," she said with a smile. "But I'll warn you, a lot of it involves getting your hands dirty." Later that evening, in his private office, Professor Zarthax reviewed the shelter analysis for the dozenth time. His assistant entered with the day's reports. "The humans' approach is causing significant discussion among the faculty," the Hydrosian reported. Professor Vreen of Advanced Mathematics called it dangerously unscientific. Zarthax's compound, eyes flickered. "And yet it worked, better than our most sophisticated designs. Shall I schedule a faculty review?" "No," Zarthax decided. "First, I want to see if this was an isolated incident or if humans possess other, unconventional solutions. Modify next week's test parameters. Include scenarios that require rapid adaptation with minimal resources." The assistant rippled with understanding. "You intend to test human limitations?" "On the contrary," Zarthax replied, studying the shelter schematic one more time. "I intend to test our own." As the artificial night settled over the academy, Sarah Chen worked in her dormitory, unaware that her simple shelter had begun to challenge centuries of established galactic engineering doctrine. She sketched new designs, incorporating lessons learned from today's analysis. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. The galaxy was vast and full of advanced civilizations, but humans had something unique to offer, the hard-won wisdom of a species that had learned to thrive in chaos. And perhaps, she thought as she finalized her sketches, that was exactly what the orderly, calculated universe needed: a little human unpredictability.